Right, so hello there. Hopefully this is all working. It should be working. Right, so we're going to take a look at today UV maps. Now obviously UV maps they can be quite complicated, but what we're going to do is use the Magic Book tutorial exercise. So we've got this done for IMVU. So there's a couple of videos showing you how to make Magic Book, very simple Magic Book. So if you've not used Blender before, this will take you through the process of making a simple, very simple Magic Book, then turning that into an accessory, a furniture item, accessory with pose, furniture item with pose, and then custom animations and custom poses. So if you're interested in that, visit this page, and the other one, which is actually yes, you can go to there, but all the source files are available for this, so you can pick up the .blend file, the Blender files for the Magic Book itself, and it'll include all the images. But the UV map that's done for the book is very simple. So we'll just use this book. So this is the animated version, but as we're just looking at the UV map, we just need the book. So the UV map for this, so if we switch to UV editing, so this is the UV editing workspace or layout. So we have the UV editor on the left and the 3D view, which has to be reset. So scale 100, view sidebar. Where's the sidebar gone? Increase that to 1500. Hide and scroll out. When you switch to different workspaces, so these are different workspaces that Blender has, and each of them basically just reorganizes the interface. So for the one we're using, we have the UV editor on the left, as I said, and the 3D view on the right, which needs to be reset because every time you move to a different workspace, Blender uses the defaults for the workspace. So if we're using this for IMVU content, that basically means that we're going to be zoomed in quite close to the items because of the scale difference between Blender and IMVU, which is about 100 times larger. So we have to reset viewport overlays and change the scale to 100 so that we're matching IMVU, and then we can switch to textured view so we can see what we're doing, but we just want the book. It'll automatically switch into edit mode in the 3D view, which then means that any face that we've got selected, so this is selected, shows up in the UV image editor. So as we've only got one face selected, that's the thing that shows up. One face, one UV. So if you want the whole UV, we have to select everything. So select all, and then that displays the entire UV map. So for this book, when we unwrapped this, what we basically did was selected, let's switch to wireframe to make it easier to see. We selected the but not easier to select because X-ray is on. There we go. We selected the pages of the book. So that's this section that's highlighted in the editor. And unwrapped those. So we selected them. And then from the UV menu, we selected unwrap. And that created this shape in the UV editor. We then inverted the selection. So select, invert. And that allowed us to unwrap the book. Or the book cover, which is this UV section. Let's zoom in a little bit. I forgot to, hang on a second. Link for sources. Can't use restream to post chat comments to YouTube, so you have to do it manually. Right, so that's right. Right, so we selected the inside of the book, or the pages, then inverted the selection and then did the cover. And what that does is it produces a pretty rough UV map. So the UVs, whoops, that's these little points, they correspond to the UVs in the 3D mesh. So if we had, let's enable UV selection mode. Enable X-ray just so this is easier to see. So where are we? We are selecting the back of the book, or the spine. So these UVs, these vertices rather, correspond to this section of the UV map. So these little dots are UV vertices, but they correspond to the vertices of the mesh. But because of the way that we did the map, it's quite rough. So what we're going to do is take a look at tidying this up a little bit using the UV editing tools. So what we have, in the same way that we have in the 3D view, we have the same tools in the UV editor, but they just work on a 2D plane. So we are just moving left, right, top to bottom, whereas we've got left, right, top to bottom, and up and down with the 3D view. So we have move, rotate, scale, and then transform, which is a universal, which includes all three in one. So what we can do is select individual vertexes. So we have our selection mode tools, vertex, edge, face, and then island, in the same way that we have vertex, edge, and face in the 3D view. So they all correspond, apart from island. Island is special because it allows us to select an entire section of an overall UV map. So activate move, what we can do in vertex select is select an individual vertex. So once we've unwrapped the book, and we added edges here to split the corners so that we get a flat UV map. So all of this is explained in the videos, in the tutorials. What we can do now is grab our vertexes and just manipulate them. So a left click dragging to align the vertexes to the grid, which we can also enable UV snap to pixels corner. So it's UV snap to pixels and then corner. And what this does is it turns the pixels of the image into an informal grid. So the vertices snap to them. So that's with snap enabled. So we can see the snapping. Let's disable that. Snap. Disabled. And then we can see how that moves smoothly because it's not snapping to the pixels. And this helps with alignment. So what we can do is just grab vertexes and align them. And unfortunately there isn't a shortcut for doing this, but when we do unwrap objects, the chances are that this sort of manipulation will be needed at some point, because Blender doesn't necessarily unwrap things uniformly or straight. But this helps with texturing, because it means your texture maps essentially are easier to work with. Because when you're painting, obviously you can get a straighter line if your UVs are all aligned, and it avoids these sorts of areas where you're having to make a short diagonal and there isn't really enough pixel space. Well, there's not enough pixels dedicated to, so we've only got 2 pixels across which we had to make a diagonal. So that results in a fuzzy line on your image. So if you can spend a few minutes to straighten up your UVs, it's going to help when you texture the item. So it's worth doing. So that's the book cover. So it's just taken a little bit of adjustment. So for the book leaves, let's just select those. Whoops, if I select. So the island selection option, if we select that, we can click on a UV section, and as mentioned earlier, it'll select the entire section of a UV. So same thing for this, vertex, and then straighten these out. And you can tell, let's just make this a little bigger, control. You can tell when a UV is aligned because you don't get the jaggies. So in order to draw a line between these 2 points, the vertex or the line has to step. So the closer to alignment the edge is, the steeper, well, the shallower the steps get. So instead of this for quite an aggressive line, we end up with this. And then eventually that. So it can be a bit tricky to assess but again it's worth doing because it means that when your UV map is being used as a texture map for a painting, you're painting a straight edge instead of one that's wonky like the original. So control spacebar, minimize that. So let's take a look at the whole thing, select all. That's a bit of an improvement. So one of the other things that we could have done to make this easier to UV unwrap. So let's just get rid of this corner. So these are seams that are marked. So let's just remove those. Clear seam. Select all. And then unwrap. So it's gone all squishy. So to make the process of unwrapping easier, instead of it being selection based, what we could have done, so if we unwrap that now, so that's what the book cover does. So what we could have done is marked, let's hide, view, sidebar, where are, where are the display? Oh, that's right. So let's hide the sharp edges. So what we could have done, instead of manually selecting faces and unwrapping the sections, what we could have done is marked a seam around the pages of the book. And that would have done the same thing, but it would have resulted in our not having to constantly select sections unless we were working with them directly. So edge select, select the edges that we want to use to define the pages of the book. Oops, not that one. So these edges, let's just go into X-ray so that's easy to see. Let's hide some of these. That's all right. So that's the edges that define the pages of the book. What we can do with that is edge, mark a seam, mark our corners to make sure the book unwraps flat, which we did again in the tutorial. This is all covered in the video. Edge, mark seam, select all. So that's our mess. UV unwrap. So it does that. So it's doing the same thing that we did originally. It just makes it easy to work with. Instead of having to select, whoops, the faces that we want to unwrap. Let's just hide this stack of books. So there are a couple of ways that you can unwrap, but the easiest is just making a selection. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could select the top and the bottom, unwrap those, and it'll, generally speaking, straighten out the UV map of those sections. Unwrap. So what you end up with are 3 sections. So what you could do with this, let's rotate that. Whoops. Hold Control to snap to the angles. You could unwrap your pages so that they had more room. So if we look at the original texture, so this section spread across the width of the image versus this, which is about twice, almost twice the size. So we're increasing the amount of texture space, the amount of texture pixels that are dedicated to these areas of the UV map, which would then mean if we inverted the selection, we've unwrapped that. Let's just do that again. Unwrap, we want conformal. So that now means our book, so if we select all, now occupies almost the entirety of the image. And of course, because you make any changes to the UV map, UV, export UV layout, so we're exporting a different UV layout. But let's unwrap. So we're using the universal or transform widget, and that gives us this tool. Let's move this into the work space. Yes, April, it is Blender 2.8. Well, 8.3. I do have a Roblox account, but I don't play it. It was mainly for content creation because you can make your own Roblox content. But in theory, you should be able to use Blender content. So anything that you make in Blender, you should be able to use it in Roblox. Not tried it yet, but it should be possible. Oh, it's we are making, well, we're not making anything at the moment. What we're doing is looking at Magic Book. So this is just a simple mesh that will get you started making content. Well, in this case, it's for IMVU, but it'll get you started making content. Yes, a lot of people are bad at Blender, but that's just, you know. This will help you get to grips with Blender. I mean, you can use this just for that, just to get to grips with doing things in Blender. You don't necessarily need to use IMVU because all the source files, all the example files are all provided and you can use them and see how you get on. But what we're doing is just looking at UV maps. So we made the book, which is explained in these video tutorials. We made a simple book and we turned that book into different types of items. So for IMVU, that's accessories, furniture, animated furniture, furniture with poses, custom poses. I don't know if you can do the same thing with Roblox, but in theory, the content that you make should be able to do the same thing with Blender. But this will help you get started and get to grips with Blender because it's just a very simple exercise. In fact, once we've gone through the once we've taken a look at the UV maps, we can probably make a little book. We can do the tutorial and show you how to make a book. Very simple. So where were we? So the UV editor. So the universal gives you this little widget, and it has these little nodules all over it. So if you click on and drag, left click drag the corners, you're scaling in both axes. So it scales on the diagonal. If you click on an edge, it scales in the direction of that particular edge. And then if you left click drag on this little node sticking out, that rotates. And then if you click drag the X, that transforms. So we're moving the UV on the X and the Y. So left click drag, it moves it, XY. Left click drag a corner, it scales it. It does the same on all of them. Left click drag an edge, so we're waiting for the double-headed mouse to appear. That scales it in one direction, just undo that. Same again for all sides. And then the nodule rotates. And whilst you're doing any of that, if you hold the control key down, it'll snap to the increments. So when you're rotating, it's the degrees. When you're scaling, it snaps to the grid. So what we were doing is using the widget to reorganize our UV. And then, of course, what we want to do is quickly switch to pixel, not pixel, vertex, and just change or modify the UV map. So yes, in theory, April, you should be able to use Blender to make Roblox content. There shouldn't be any problems with that. Just might have to do a bit of experimenting. So that's straight. Right, so, and of course that then means that we need to re-export the UV map. Let's stretch that out a little bit because we've made changes to it. So we do that. Don't have to select everything, but select all. UV, export UV layout, get the file dialog, Magic Book, UV2, format is generally going to be PNG all the time, fill opacity 0 for just a wireframe, come on, 0 for just a wireframe, and then 1 for a filled object. So click UV layout and that exports the updated. So let's just save this actually. Save as. And this is '38, '39, so this is number 40. Right, so let's just do a quick, I'm going to switch back to layout, which is the general layout. So these are the magic books that we had before. So if just unhide Alt H. Come on, where is it not working? There we go. Oop, that's unhidden everything. We don't want that. So that's the magic book furniture item. It's got a simple animation. So let's make a very simple magic book. So what we want to do is add mesh cube. That's dropped into the scene. Let's just hide these objects at the moment. So we can use the outliner for that. Hide. So we're going to start with this cube, or start from this cube. What we want to do, switch to scale widget and just scale the object. So left click drag on the handles. Let's make this quite a thick book and just create a book shape or a lozenge. So you want to start from that. So that is your base shape, which we then need to fix because we've changed the shape of the object. So undo, undo, undo. So we've changed the shape of the object from a cube. Redo to that. Is that it? Once more. So we need to fix its shape. So that's object, apply, rotation and scale. And this is explained in the tutorial in the video, so watch that and you'll find out why. So rotation and scale. So what we can now do is create the pages of our book. So we want to be in edit mode. So we switch using the context menu. So we've got all these different options. We want edit mode. We want to switch to face select, just so that it makes it easy to do this next bit where we want to select a couple of faces. So these side faces, like so. And then what we'll use is the inset tool. Click to activate, and then we'll get this little tool popping up. So left click drag on the node just to start the tool, and you can either left click drag it so that it does what it's doing on screen now. So it insets, so it's creating a set of faces that are inset, hence the name, from our original selection. So you can left click drag and then release when you're happy, or you can left click drag and start the tool, it's insetting, and then type a value. So let's type 0.5. Whoops. Ooh, that's tiny. Backspace. Let's try 5 then. So that's 5. Backspace, that deletes the value and resets the tool. Let's try 10. So that's typing 10 and then enter to confirm. So that's our inset pages. And then what we can do next is extrude. So that's that tool. And extrude these, whoops. So this is tricky because we need to do this on 2 axes. So although we have extrude along normals, that doesn't always work. But let's select that. We'll get a similar tool widget. So left click drag on the node and then scale inwards. And it is working in the sense that it's going along 2 axes, but the distance between this edge and this edge and this edge and this edge in this corner are different. So we have to keep an eye out for that. But that'll work. So left click again, that confirms, and then we have to correct so we can see that that is thicker than that. So we'll have to switch to edge select, select that edge and its opposite, and what we want here is a scale tool. So we have to activate a manipulator to disable one of the what do they call these tools? One of the editing tools, modifying tools. No, what do they call them? No idea. And what we can do is left click drag on the red handle, hold down shift to slow this down, and then we can eyeball the distance and then left click. So we're almost there. Let's just toggle out of object mode, select these and hide them. H. And these. So we're almost there with a book. So all we need to do now, loop cut, enable that. So we've got number of cuts at the top here. We want 2. So click on the, there's one on either side of the input field. 2. Mouse over one of the vertical edges because we're making a horizontal cut. We're basically splitting the vertical edges. Click and it drops in 2 edges. What we can do with that, move manipulator, keep those active, and then just left click drag, and we create the curve of our spine and the curve of the inset pages in one action. And that is a very simple book in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, half a dozen steps. Very simple. And then you can export that. Once you've got it all textured and all that sort of stuff, all that lovely stuff, you can export that for whatever you want it to be used as. But one or two other things that we can do. Object, shade smooth. So the book now goes all mushy. Back into edit mode. What we can do now is select these edges around the page section. So that's what we have. Edge, mark sharp. Then we're going to modifiers. We'll play around with this in a second. Modifiers, edge split. And what we want to disable is edge angle. So this will only sharpen the edges that we have specifically marked. So you see what happened there. Let's move that to the side. So they go from mushy to sharp. And we can do that all around the book. So that was right click, Alt click to select the loop. Goes all around the book. Whoops. And again. Then any remaining edges. And that is a very simple book. So to unwrap and add a material to this, make sure it's selected. Material properties. There is no material assigned, so we have to create one. So we can either click on the plus button or we can click on the new button. So the difference is that clicking on the plus button just adds an entry in the material list. If we click the new button, it'll add an entry and it'll populate the material with some basic settings. Like so. And then once we've got that, we can rename this. Big book. So we're using nodes, so that now means we have to go into shading workspace. Scroll out to set up our basic material. So we're just doing a basic material. So we've got principled BSDF and material output. Those are the two default nodes that we then add a texture, image texture to. So add texture, image texture. And we don't have an image for this yet, so we're going to create a new one. So click the new button and that'll give us the new image pop up. We'll call this big book. Want its size to be 512, width by 256. Let's use the generated type. So it's blank at the moment, so let's switch to color grid and then click OK. And then link color output to base color input. And there is our image, which we now have to UV unwrap. So we make the mesh, add the material, and then unwrap. So the image has appeared on the object because by default primitives, the shape that we originally added, the cube, they have a basic UV map assigned to them. But because we've shaped the cube, it now means that that UV map is basically useless. So for that we switch to UV editing. Yoink! Where's our book? There's our book. So we want to select all, and that's the default. So switch to island. So that's the default, which is a messed up cube. So what we can do now is use some of the things that we were talking about earlier. So we're in edge select, and let's mark some seams. Oops, not that, these edges, because what we want to do is separate the inner pages of the book from the cover. So that's what we have selected. Edge, mark, seam. They highlight. And we know from the shape of this book that it's going to get a bit messy when we unwrap the cover, so we're going to split the corners, which also means adding, whoops, a seam along those corners. So select, mark seam. And what we can do now is select all, UV, unwrap. We want, for an object like this that is a regular shape, so it's got lots of right angles and sharp edges, in the unwrap pop-up that appears whenever you unwrap something, we can select the method. So if we switch to angle based, we'll get a UV map that looks like that. If we switch to conformal, it makes the shape much more regulated and suitable for a book. And the other settings we don't necessarily need to mess around with, but that's all we need. So it sorts out the alignment of the image on our book. So let's do some editing for the UV map. So we're in island selection, selecting the page element. We'll use the universal or the transform widget. Rotate, left click, drag the node. Left click, drag the X in the center of the map, and let's scale this outwards. That is massive because we've got a big book. Same for the pages or the cover. Whoops. And then what we want to do is straighten up our UVs. So we've still got UV, where is it? Snap to pixels. We've still got that active. So that's always a good idea to enable that to make it easier to work with the texture. So this is one of the problems with the transform widget. If you're selecting a group and there is a distance between the elements that you've selected, the tool appears and all the handles are visible. But if you're selecting something that's in line, the widget has appeared, but we can't access any of the tools. So that's one downside to using the transform tool. So just straighten up the UVs. And the book. So again, we're just doing this because it means that come time to painting the texture, it means that we're dealing with a lot of straight edges as opposed to very small angles, which can be difficult to paint and result in blurry textures. So double check. And if you're finding it tricky to manipulate the UVs and see what you're doing at the same time, what you can do, view, sidebar, and because this is a generated type, so the image that we're using is generated internally by Blender, so it's a virtual texture. So what we can do is in the image panel or the image tab, we've got the type visible, and what we can do is just toggle between the options that are available so that we can actually see what we're doing more easily. We can also, particularly for blank, what we can do is change the color depending on your preference so that it makes it easier to see what we're doing. So that's the UV grid, and then that's the color grid. And then once we're done, which we are, select all, UV, export UV layout. So we'll call this Big Book UV PNG, full opacity, that's okay, and then export. And that, let's open Affinity. Close. Where's the image gone? Why did we save that? UV, export layout, furniture. Scroll, scroll, scroll. Scroll, scroll, scroll. There it is. Right, so cancel. So that's the UV, and that is the image of the UV that we've exported. So now that we've got this as an actual image, a bitmap or a PNG, what we can do with this image. Now, which way is the best way to do this? Yeah, so let's just replace it. So replace, browse to, there's Big Book UV, replace image. That replaces the image that's assigned or associated with the UV, but we still have to go back into shading, and we have to make an adjustment to, oh no, it's done it. Oh no, that's all right. Perfect. So you can do this two ways. You can either replace the image in the editor, in the UV image editor, and it'll sometimes not do this, but it'll update in shading, it'll update the material to use the image that we've associated with the book. Or you can load the image into the material, which will then need to be reassigned to the UV in the UV image editor. So it's an either or depending on what you're doing. But that is our magic book with our texture. And that took 20 minutes just to do that book. So don't need to do anything complicated. But that's a very simple exercise of making something using Blender that started from a cube. So that's what we started with. It's a very simple object. Did some very basic editing unwrapped it, added our material, and we've got something that we can use in, well, IMVU, Roblox, doesn't matter. Let's just save that. So there we are. We were looking at primarily UV maps, but just a little bit of an exercise in making our little magic book. And of course, because of the way, where is it? UV editing. Because of the way that we've actually unwrapped this. So this is one of the things that you want to think about when you are unwrapping your objects. So when we unwrap this to have the edges or the pages as sections of the UV map, so we were trying to use as much space as possible, so each of these sections occupied their own little area of the UV map, and then obviously we had the book cover. So the problem with doing it that way is that that doesn't leave any space. We've got no room to do anything else to the book. So if we were wanting to, let's say at some point we wanted to add some fancy corners to our book. So we've got some of those fancy metal corners added to our book. They obviously need to be unwrapped. But if you unwrap, so we've got our sections. So if we had unwrapped the object like this, we no longer have room to unwrap these new elements, and we would likely have to include them on the main book cover UV. Now if we do that, it means that we lose definition, because we're using up, well, we're not using up, we're using we're using up less texture space to describe these little details. Whereas if we unwrap the object as we've got it now, we've got all of this space that we could dedicate to each four corner. And depending on how we choose to unwrap the corners, so what that could mean is that if you wanted to paint details on each of the corners, you now have space within your texture to show that detail. So there's things like that you want to watch out for when you're making your items, to give yourself room. You don't always have to occupy the entire texture the first time you make your object. So be thinking ahead in terms of, yes, this is just a simple book, but you could also use this same book as a template to make other things. So we can add things to this, add details that we then have the space to texture in our UV map. So that's something to keep an eye on when you are making your projects. Right, so we'll call it quits there, and we shall see you on the next video. I'm not sure when that will be, but again, we might be exploring a different aspect of this project. And hide, so that's Alt H, or object, where is it? Show hide. Hide, no, show hidden objects. That's the one. Oop, there's that box again, get rid of that. Just have to move our big magic book out of the way now. So what we might do in the next video or the next stream is look at some other aspects of this project and what we can do to it so that it's just a simple project, very, very simple. What we can do to it to make it more interesting without getting caught up with doing a lot of work, because it can be quite intimidating. So this might appear, the fact that this is animating, quite intimidating, but it's not. Doesn't need to be. So we'll take a look at something to do with that in the next stream. But that's UV maps and making a simple magic book that we'll now have to use in something. Oh, I know what we might be able to do in the next one is different materials. Because all these books use the same material. So what we might have a look at is different materials or assigning materials. Right, anyway, we'll see you on the next one. So bye for now, everyone.